He thought he was just giving water to a dying man, but when Elias Boone carried that wounded stranger back to his ranch, he didn't realize he was preventing a war, one buried beneath silence, secrets, and sacred ground. What began with a single drink would ripple across generations, transforming a forgotten patch of desert into a sanctuary where broken souls came to heal. No fame, no headlines, just a cup of water, and the fire that never died. This is the story of how peace was kept, one quiet act at a time. Elias Boone had lived most of his life with one hand on a shovel and the other near a rifle. His father taught him early that land didn't belong to a man unless he bled for it. That rain wasn't something you hoped for. It was something you earned. By the time he turned 54, Elias had stopped counting how many winters he'd survived, how many steers he'd buried, or how many mornings he'd stood on his porch and wondered why the silence felt heavier than it used to. His ranch sat low in the valley east of Painted Rock, 5 miles from the nearest town and 200 yards from a bend in the dry riverbed where buzzards circled most summers. He had a barn full of rust, 2 dogs too old to chase anything, and 1 horse that didn't let anyone else touch it. No wife, no kids, just a memory of both. They'd left years ago, his son to the war, his wife to something lonelier. He woke before the sun, drank his coffee black and burnt, and spent most of his days talking to the animals like they understood. Sometimes he rode fence. Sometimes he just sat and listened to the wind. And when the wind spoke in tongues, he kept his hand near the old Winchester hanging above the door. It was early September when he found the man. Or maybe the man found him. Elias had been checking the north line of the property, barbed wire hanging slack in places, sagebrush creeping where it didn't belong, when his horse bucked slightly at the scent of something not right. Elias dismounted, boots hitting the hardpan dust, and followed the edge of the arroyos until he saw a splash of color that didn't belong to the earth. A man lay crumpled near the rocks, half covered in dirt, blood crusted on his side like rust on metal. His skin was dark, his hair long, braided in places but matted with blood and sweat. He wore no shirt, just a sash around his waist, boots nearly worn through, and a leather strap slung across his chest, broken and dangling. Elias knelt beside him. He didn't speak, just checked for breath, pulse, signs of life. The man stirred faintly, lips cracked, eyelids fluttering, like he wasn't sure the world he saw was real. "Water," the man whispered. Elias pulled the canteen from his belt and tilted it to the man's mouth. The first swallow was desperate. The second nearly choked him. The third was smoother. Elias looked around. No horse, no tracks that led away. Whoever had left him here hadn't planned for him to live. "You got a name?" Elias asked. The man tried to speak, failed, then rasped, "Too soon." Too soon for what? But the man had passed out again. Elias sighed, sat back on his heels, and stared at the sky. The sun was just beginning to crest the ridge, and already the heat was rising. He had no time for this, no space in his life for strangers bleeding out on his land. But something in the way the man breathed, like each inhale was a battle, pulled at him. He couldn't ride away. Not again. He hoisted the man onto his saddle, tied him down, and led the horse home on foot. It took 3 hours. By the time they reached the ranch, the man was burning with fever. Elias carried him into the house, laid him on the same bed his son used to sleep in. He boiled water, cleaned the wound with whiskey, stitched the skin tight even when the man screamed through clenched teeth. He didn't ask questions, didn't want answers, not yet. He just worked. When the fever broke 3 nights later, the man opened his eyes and said one word, "Peace." Elias poured him a cup of water. "You're a long way from that, son." The man drank slow, then looked around the room like he was remembering what a ceiling felt like. "My name is Tokala," he said. Elias nodded. "Boone." Neither man offered more, not yet. Outside, the wind changed direction. The third morning after the fever broke, Tokala sat up without help. He moved slow, his breath still shallow, but the pain in his side no longer lit his face like fire each time he shifted. Elias had been sitting in the corner with a cup of coffee, watching the window as the sky stretched pale blue across the hills. "You stitch like someone who's done it before," Tokala said quietly. Elias didn't look at him. "I've stitched cattle, sometimes men. Wounds don't care who they're on." Tokala's lips curled into something halfway between a smile and a grimace. "You talk like you've seen too many of both." "I have." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was understood. There were questions neither of them wanted to ask yet, and answers neither of them were ready to give. Elias finally turned his head and asked the first one that mattered. "Who left you out there?" Tokala stared at his hands. They were strong hands, calloused and scarred, but right now they trembled faintly, barely visible. Men with rifles, government issue, not cavalry, not ranch hands. I don't know who they were, only who they weren't. "Why?" "Because I said no." Elias raised an eyebrow. "To what?" "Carrying a message that wasn't true. Signing something that didn't belong to me. Pretending war was needed when it wasn't." Elias sipped his coffee. "So they tried to silence you." Tokala nodded once. "They thought they did." The way he said it sent something cold up Elias's spine. He'd seen men silenced before, on battlefields and in back rooms, in the way letters stopped coming and families stopped looking. But Tokala didn't have the look of a man silenced. He had the look of someone carrying thunder in his chest and waiting for the right time to open his mouth. Elias stood. "You're not safe yet. I know. You stay here, people are going to come looking." Tokala looked up. "They already are." That evening, Elias saddled the horse and rode out past the south ridge. The wind was dry and the clouds low, stormlight with no storm yet. He checked the fence lines with practiced eyes, but it wasn't wire he was looking for. He scanned the hills, watched the road, listened for engines or hooves or the telltale click of metal that didn't belong to the land. He saw nothing, but the quiet was wrong. The next morning the dogs wouldn't stop pacing. Elias noticed it first around dawn. Whiskey and Jack, both old and half-deaf, suddenly alert and sniffing the floor, the corners of the porch, the windowsills. When Elias stepped outside, he found boot prints in the dust. Too clean, too deep. He didn't wake Tokala, not yet. He just loaded his rifle and sat on the porch with his coffee, eyes on the road. By noon, a black car came up the long dirt path. Something government by the look of it, boxy, heavy. It stopped just before the gate. Two men stepped out, clean shirts, dustless boots, faces too flat to trust. Elias stood. "You Elias Boone?" one of them asked. "I am." "We're looking for a man came through here, hurt, dark hair, wounded in the side. Might go by Tokala, might go by something else." Elias leaned against the post. "Don't know anyone by that name." One of the men took a step forward. "You sure? Your neighbor said you brought someone in a few nights ago, said he looked bad off." "My neighbor drinks more than he listens." The man smirked. "Mind if we take a look around?" "I do." "That a threat?" "No," Elias said, stepping forward, his hand loose but close to his hip. "It's a boundary." The man looked at the other, who gave a subtle nod. "If you see anyone matching that description, you're going to want to let us know." "I'll put it on my list." They left in silence. That night, Elias double-locked the barn. Tokala came outside for the first time since arriving. He stood under the stars, breathing deep, like someone who hadn't had sky in a long time. "They came," Elias said. Tokala nodded. "I felt it." "What do they want?" "A war. They want me gone so someone else can give them permission to start it." "What war?" Tokala looked at him, and then said something Elias would never forget. "The one that ends peace." Elias didn't ask more that night. He let Tokala stand under the stars as long as he needed, let the cold settle into the wood of the porch, let the silence stretch until even the wind stopped asking questions. Some truths didn't need to be pried loose. They needed to be waited on, like rain in a dry season. But inside, Elias was already turning the pieces. The way Tokala spoke, the fear stitched into his quiet moments, the line about peace and the people who wanted it dead. Elias had fought in one war. He pitted buried brothers from another, and if there was one thing he knew, it was how to hear the sound of conflict before it reached your doorstep. He didn't say it out loud, but he'd begun preparing. The next morning, he filled every canteen in the barn, checked the feed bins, the tool shed, the storm cellar. There were sacks of dried beans and flour from last season. A few mason jars left by his wife in the pantry he still hadn't had the heart to clear out. He counted the bullets in the Winchester, the shells for the shotgun, the spare revolver that stayed hidden in the drawer beneath the stove. Tokala watched him do it all without comment. By sundown, they were both on the porch again. "You think they're coming back?" Tokala asked. Elias didn't answer right away, just watched the sun dip low, flattening into the horizon like a smoldering coal. "They don't send a car unless they think you matter," Elias said, "and they don't send polite men first unless they plan to send impolite ones next." Tokala rubbed his chest just above the healing wound. "They'll come, and not just for me. They'll come for anyone who stood near me." Elias raised his coffee to his lips. "Then I guess I'm standing pretty close." That night they sat at the table with a map laid out between them. It was one Elias had kept folded in the drawer for years, a hand-drawn topography of the surrounding land, ridges, canyons, cattle paths. No one but him and the coyotes remembered. Tokala traced a finger along the southern edge. "This ridge connects to hollow ground, sacred to my people. What lies under it cannot be disturbed. But there's ore, silver, maybe uranium, something worth dying over to men like them." Elias blinked slowly. "So they want to clear it out, claim it, lay pipe, dig it up." Tokala nodded. "They tried the tribes first, got told no. They found me next, said I could speak sense to the elders, said I'd be rewarded. And when you said no?" Tokala looked down at the map. "They shot me in the ribs and left me in the dirt." Elias leaned back in his chair. "And if they don't get what they want peacefully, they'll make a war, false flag, staged conflict, call us rebels, radicals. They'll provoke the young ones. All they need is an excuse." Elias stared at the map, at the red marks Tokala had drawn where weapons caches might be hidden, where messengers might be traveling, where a line, once crossed, would open something that couldn't be closed again. "If I hadn't found you," Elias said softly, "this would have already started, wouldn't it?" Tokala didn't answer. He didn't need to. The war had already begun, but no one had fired the first shot yet. 3 days passed, quiet ones. Elias let Tokala recover in full. The man's strength returned quickly. He moved through the house like someone who didn't want to leave a trace, but also someone who belonged. He repaired a broken hinge on the barn door, oiled Elias's saddle, fed the dogs, and every night they watched the stars from the porch, speaking less and less. On the 4th day, the men came back. This time, not in suits. 2 trucks, dust trailing like warning smoke, 5 men, all armed, no badges, no pretense. Elias saw them from the ridge where he was cutting brush. He dropped the shears, mounted his horse, and galloped hard down to the house. By the time he got there, Tokala was already waiting. He had tied his braids back, rolled up his sleeves, and stood in the center of the yard like someone preparing not for a fight, but for an offering. "You should hide," Elias said. Tokala didn't move. "They know I'm here. It's time they knew who else is." The trucks pulled to a stop. Engines idled. A man stepped out of the lead vehicle, tall, square shoulders, eyes like glass. "You've had a guest," he called out. Elias stood beside Tokala now. "Had a few, he replied. The man smiled. "We're looking for one in particular. Stole something of value from us." Elias spat into the dirt. "Didn't know integrity was for sale." The smile disappeared. "You interfering, rancher?" "Already did. Got the blood on my floorboards to prove it." "You realize what you're doing?" "I do." Another man stepped out of the second truck. This one held a long gun, sighted. Tokala didn't flinch. "You fire that," he said calmly, "and 50 horses will ride out of the canyon behind you before you draw your next breath." The armed man hesitated. Elias could feel the air tighten. Then, from somewhere behind the trucks, came the sound of hooves. Not one, not two. Dozens. The men turned. From the northern ridge, 50 warriors appeared, Apache, painted and armed, riding in formation, silent but unstoppable. Their presence was not dramatic. It was sacred. The kind of silence that made men rethink who they were. Elias smiled. "I guess I wasn't the only one standing close." The leader of the armed men backed up slowly, hand twitching at his sidearm. "This doesn't have to go bad," he said. Tokala stepped forward. "It already has." He walked past Elias, past the porch, past the dogs, growling low. He walked straight to the front of the trucks and stopped 5 feet from the leader. "My father's grave lies beneath that ridge," he said. "You desecrate it, and you won't start a war. You'll just finish one. Your kind began centuries ago." And no one moved. The wind stopped. The armed man slowly lifted his hands. "This isn't our fight," he said. "We were just told to bring you in." "Then leave," Elias said, "and tell whoever sent you to come themselves next time." The man looked between them, then nodded. They turned and drove away. No shots fired, no blood spilled. Just the kind of silence that came after something ancient had turned in the soil. When they were gone, the horses approached the house. One by one, the warriors dismounted. They did not speak. They simply bowed to Tokala, and then to Elias. Because the man who gave water to a dying warrior did not just save a life. He stopped a war before it began. That night, the fire behind the barn burned higher than it ever had. Not because they fed it more wood, but because it was fed by something older: respect, memory, warning. The kind of fire that knew it was being watched not just by the people who gathered around it, but by the land itself. Elias sat beside it with a blanket over his knees and his old dog resting its head on his boot. Tokala knelt across from him, not speaking, hands resting on his thighs. Around them the warriors ate in silence. Some passed tobacco, others painted symbols in the dirt. No one raised a voice. No one asked questions. Because when peace has to be earned in blood and silence, there is no room for noise. One of the elders, a man with silver hair woven into 2 long braids, came forward and sat beside Tokala. He placed a pouch on the ground and unwrapped it slowly, revealing 5 small stones, flat, smooth, etched with symbols. He handed one to Elias. Elias turned it over in his palm, a circle. Inside it, a bird, wings outstretched, a line drawn through its heart. Tokala explained. "That's the keeper's stone. It's given to someone who held the line between memory and forgetting." Elias cleared his throat but didn't speak. "You weren't just a man with land," Tokala said. "You became part of the story. You turned your house into shelter. And that's not something the wind forgets." Elias pocketed the stone, not for pride, just because it felt like the right thing to do. The warriors didn't stay long. By dawn, they had packed their gear and mounted up. Tokala remained. He wasn't done, not yet. He stood at the gate, watching them disappear over the rise, then turned to Elias. "I need to go back to my people," he said. "Tell them the truth. Let them know what almost happened. You'll be safe getting there?" Tokala looked toward the rising sun. "They'll know I didn't die. That changes everything." Elias nodded. "But before I go," Tokala said, "I want to leave something behind." He walked to the barn and came back with a small bundle. Inside, a hide scroll, rolled tight, tied with a red thread. He handed it to Elias. "It's a treaty," Tokala said. "Not government written, not signed with pens, a true one, between you and mine." "I didn't know we were at war. That's why it means more." Elias placed the scroll inside the house, tucked it into a drawer he once used to hold maps and bills and letters from a son who never came home. Tokala left that afternoon, riding Elias's second horse, the one no one else had ever touched. The animal followed him without protest. Elias stood on the porch and watched them until they were a speck on the horizon. The days that followed were quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for conversation. Elias fed the animals, walked the fence line, sat on the porch each evening with his rifle near the door and the fire behind the barn still burning. He didn't speak of what happened, not to the neighbors, not to the feed store clerk, not even to the postman who left mail once a week, and always asked if Elias had heard about the men who disappeared out near the ridge. He just nodded. Then one morning a letter arrived. No return address. Inside a photo, black and white, grainy, of Elias standing beside Tokala, both looking out over the valley. On the back, a single sentence. "Peace is a story we tell with our actions, not our words." Weeks passed, then months. The government never returned. No trucks, no men in suits, no bulldozers. The mineral claim was withdrawn, quietly, without explanation. Later, Elias would learn that several tribal councils had signed a shared declaration to protect the sacred ground under federal observance, a move that only happened because someone, unnamed, brought them proof of what had almost happened. Tokala. Elias didn't need credit. He didn't want it. But one day, a boy rode up to his house, 15 maybe, hair in a short braid, eyes sharp. "You're the man who gave him water," the boy said. "I am." The boy held out a small wooden carving, a hawk in flight. "He said you'd understand." Elias took it, turned it over in his hand. "I do." The boy stayed for the night, slept in the barn, left at dawn. Elias added the carving to the shelf beside the stone. The fire behind the barn still burned, always would. And in the valley below, where war might have raged, there was only wind and peace. The days after Tokala left bled into each other like ink on old paper, slow, spreading, and full of quiet weight. Elias didn't talk to anyone about what had happened, and no one came asking. The men in the black trucks didn't return. The neighbors didn't mention strange visitors or the sounds of hooves echoing off the ridge that night. But the silence wasn't absence. It was reverence. Something had passed through the land, and the land was holding its breath in gratitude. Elias found himself walking the fence lines more often, even when they didn't need mending. The act of walking calmed something in him, gave him a way to sort the thoughts that had started building up like dust in the corners of the house. He would carry the carved hawk in his pocket, running his thumb over the smooth wooden wings whenever the air felt tight or the memories too sharp. He wasn't a man for words, not even in his own head, but he started writing again. Not letters, just short lines in a leather-bound book he hadn't touched since his son went off to fight a war he never returned from. He asked for water. I gave him life. Peace is what happens when men choose silence instead of shouting. Fire doesn't always mean destruction. Some days he only wrote a sentence, some days none at all. But the book filled. In the second week of October, the first cold wind of the season pushed through the valley. It came down the ridgeline hard, scattering the brittle leaves from the cottonwoods near the dry creek bed. That night, Elias lit the fire behind the barn again. Not because it needed to be lit, there hadn't been visitors for weeks, but because it felt like the right thing to do. And that night, someone came. He heard the horse before he saw the rider, just after midnight. The rhythm of hooves not in a rush, not dragging, steady, purposeful. Elias stood from his chair and stepped off the porch, shotgun resting loose in one hand. The rider stopped 10 yards from the house. The moonlight caught the figure just enough. Not Tokala. A woman. Her hair braided tight over one shoulder, her coat dust-covered and stitched with a bead pattern Elias recognized, one of the Red Earth clans. She didn't speak at first, just dismounted, tied her horse without needing to look, and walked up to him like she knew exactly where she was and exactly who he was. "You're the one who helped him," she said. Elias didn't need to ask who. "I am." She nodded once. "He's alive because of you." "He saved himself," Elias said. "I just gave him a chance to do it." She looked out toward the barn where the firelight danced against the fence posts. "He told me this land changed the story. He said you didn't even know the war was about to start." "I didn't." She stepped closer, then reached into the pouch at her waist and held out a folded piece of cloth. "Then, this is yours." He unfolded it slowly. Inside was a small feather, blue-black, edged in white, sacred to her people. A symbol of life protected, of wisdom earned. "I don't need this," he said softly. "But you earned it," she replied. He took it without another word, carried it into the house, placed it on the shelf beside the hawk and the stone. The woman stayed 3 nights, didn't say much, fed the dogs, helped fix the west fence, spent an afternoon alone out by the fire, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, her eyes closed, hands resting on her knees. Before she left, she placed a bundle of sweetgrass on the steps and carved a word into the porch rail with a knife she wore on her hip. Kept. Elias didn't touch it, didn't sand it down, just ran his fingers over the grooves now and then when the day grew long. Winter settled in like an old friend with tired hands. Snow came early, thick, heavy. It lay across the pasture like a shroud, softening every edge. Elias stayed inside more. His knees ached. His firewood stack shrank too quickly. But he never let the fire behind the barn go out. Every night he bundled himself in the coat he'd worn for decades and carried a single split-log disser out into the dark. One night he found a bundle already there, still warm, still smoking. He looked around, no one in sight. But the footprints in the snow were small, bare. Someone had come on foot, and someone had added to the fire. That was when he realized it wasn't his anymore. It belonged to all of them now. By spring, people began to arrive again, quietly, like before. A man who had forgotten how to pray. A girl who carried her mother's ashes in a tin box and whispered her name into the fire every night for a week. A couple who hadn't spoken in months, who sat on opposite sides of the pit until the silence between them softened into something close to love again. Elias didn't ask their stories. He never did. He just handed them water, showed them where the fire was, and told them they were welcome to stay as long as they needed. Sometimes that was one night, sometimes a season. One boy stayed for a year, never said where he came from, never said where he was going, but when he left behind a book. Inted page after page of sketches, people by the fire, the barn, the ridge, and one page near the end a drawing of Elias sitting in his chair, hand outstretched with a cup of water. Beneath it the boy had written, "This is where the war ended and where I began." That spring was the greenest the valley had seen in years. Rain came in thick sheets, falling straight and hard for days, flooding the dry creek beds and soaking deep into the soil until even the rocks seemed to swell with it. The kind of rain that made the land remember what it was like to be young. Elias spent most of the season walking the pastures, checking for erosion, picking out the weeds that came up too fast. His back hurt more often now, and his legs didn't carry him as far as they used to. But every morning he was out there before the sun, before the wind, before the world had time to shake itself awake. One morning he found a feather tied to the fence post by the south ridge. White, long, bound with a strip of cloth that looked like it had been dipped in ash. He didn't touch it. He just nodded. He knew what it meant. By the end of May, he counted 32 separate visitors who had come through since the winter thaw. Some left names in a book he kept by the fire now. Most didn't. but he remembered every face, every pair of eyes that looked at the fire like it was the first safe thing they'd seen in years. One woman came and stayed for 3 days without ever speaking. She spent all her time by the old stone circle Tokala had built near the barn, laying her hand on each stone as if reading some long-lost language. When she left, Elias found a necklace hanging from the fence gate. On it, a single copper charm shaped like a hand. That night, the fire burned blue. No one knew why. They didn't ask. Taza returned in early June, older now, the lines around his eyes deeper, his beard streaked with gray. He came on foot this time. No horse, no escort. Just a walking stick carved with a bird in flight and a pack slung over one shoulder. Elias saw him coming from the porch and walked down to meet him. They didn't speak until they were sitting together by the fire. "I buried my father last month," Taza said softly. Elias nodded. "I figured something had changed." Taza stared into the flames. "He died in the same valley I was supposed to lead a war into. He saw it end first." "He saw you first," Taza said. "He told me once after I came home. He said, 'That man gave you water, and in doing so gave us another son.'" Elias said nothing, just reached over and added another log to the fire. They sat there until the sun went down, the flames painting their faces with the stories neither of them needed to say out loud. Taza stayed a week. During that time, he carved 5 new stones and added them to the circle. One for his father, one for the men who tried to kill him, one for the ridge, one for the ones who never got to choose peace. And the last one he gave to Elias. He placed it in his hands like a child passing a gift to a parent. Etched into the surface was a single word: keeper. Elias didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. That summer, children started coming with their parents, not because the place was advertised, not because it was known, because it was remembered. The kind of remembering that moved in stories told beside beds, in the hush between 2 breaths, in the way someone said, "You should go, you'll understand when you see it." They came on bicycles, on foot, in pickups older than Elias. Some brought offerings, bundles of sweetgrass, jars of honey, charcoal sketches of the land. Some brought nothing at all but a look that said, "Please let this be the place." And it was, always. The fire behind the barn never went out. One evening, just after the sun dipped behind the hills and the air turned gold, a boy no older than 8 approached Elias where he sat on the porch. The boy held a small stick in one hand and a piece of cloth in the other. He said, "I heard you stopped a war." Elias looked down at him. "I just gave a man some water." The boy nodded as if that made sense. "Is that how you stop wars?" Elias looked out at the fire, at the trees lining the edge of the pasture, at the sun just brushing the tops of the grass. "Sometimes," he said, "it's how you stop the first one." The boy handed him the stick. On it he had scratched a shape, lopsided, rough, simple. A cup. Elias took it, turned it in his hand, and smiled. The boy ran back to the others without waiting for thanks. The fire cracked behind him, and Elias felt something settle in his chest. Peace, maybe, or the memory of what it had cost to protect it. The sun rose slower in late August, and Elias noticed the way the light bent differently now. Softer, somehow, less eager. The shadows stretched longer, lingered a little more. It reminded him of the last days of summer when he was a boy, when the wind smelled like school and the air tasted like endings. He didn't mind. Endings didn't scare him anymore. That year, he built a second bench beside the fire. Not because he needed it, he rarely sat on more than one spot, but because people had started coming in pairs, fathers and sons, grandmothers and granddaughters, 2 sisters who hadn't spoken in 5 years, but came together because one of them dreamed of a fire in the desert and couldn't shake the pull of it. They stayed a week, left a shared journal on the bench, page after page of secrets, scrawled in 2 different handwritings. Elias never read it, just stored it beside the others in the box under the table near the porch, There were 10 journals now, some leather-bound, some spiral, one just loose-leaf pages tied with twine, all filled with the stories of people who had once been strangers until the fire made them something else. Family, maybe, or witnesses. That fall, a young man arrived from the east, his hair buzzed short, his posture stiff with military training that hadn't quite worn off. He had no bags, just a knife on his belt, and a single photograph in his pocket, a woman holding a child smiling in sunlight. Elias didn't ask. He showed him to the cabin closest to the oak. For 3 days the young man said nothing. He chopped wood, fixed the creaking gate, fed the chickens. Then, on the 4th morning, just as the sky turned gray and wide with early dawn, he stood beside the fire and spoke. "I was supposed to deliver the order," he said. "The one that would have started it. I knew it wasn't right. But orders aren't about right." No one interrupted him. He continued, "I disobeyed, burned it. I've been running since, trying to figure out if I made peace or just delayed something that can't be stopped." Elias stood from his chair, walked over, and handed him a ladle of water from the basin. "Drink," he said. The young man took it, confused, drank. Then Elias said, "Now you've made peace." And that was that. The man stayed for a month, left a tin badge in the fire. It didn't melt. It blackened, curled, and stayed there, half swallowed by ash. A year passed, then another. People kept coming. Elias stopped counting. He built a shelter near the barn, open walls, beds for those too tired to speak their name. Taza visited once a season, always leaving something behind, a pouch, a carving, a story told only to Elias. Rosita passed on the winter solstice. She died in her sleep in the cabin closest to the cedar grove. They buried her near the brother tree. A stone was carved with her name. But her real memorial was the garden she planted each spring, and the children she taught to sew with open hands and patient hearts. Elias got slower. The fire never did. Even when the wind screamed across the ridge, even when the snow came down sideways, the fire stayed lit. People watched it like it was scripture. One night, in his 81st year, Elias sat beside the flames, wrapped in the coat he'd worn for half his life. The sky was clear, stars burning low and gold. Leah sat beside him now, grown, quiet, her hands calloused and her gaze unflinching. "You ready to rest?" she asked. Elias didn't speak. He just smiled. The next morning, he didn't wake. But when Leah opened the door at dawn, she found a single cup of water on the porch railing, and the fire behind the barn, burning as if someone had just fed it. They buried Elias beneath the oak tree, beside the stone that read, "Keeper and the Hawk" carving that had once been left by a boy whose name nobody remembered. They sang no songs. They didn't need to, because the land already knew the melody. After that, Leah kept the fire going. She didn't try to replace Elias. She didn't need to. She just sat in his chair, read the journals, added names to the ledger, and offered water to anyone who came up the path. The people still came. They always would. Because somewhere in the hills, where the dust rose and the wind curled like prayer, they knew peace had once been offered without question. Because a man had once seen a dying warrior and chose not to ask who he was. He gave him water and stopped a war. Elias never spoke of what happened that summer, not to his neighbors, not to the feed store clerk, not even to the preacher who came by once every few weeks to check if he was still breathing. He didn't lie. He just let the truth stay buried in the roots of the valley, in the soil that remembered more than any man ever could. But the land changed. He saw it in the way the dogs perked their ears at certain winds, in the way the birds circled tighter above the ridge, in the way silence stretched out longer than usual, like the air was waiting to see if peace would hold. And it did, for a time. In mid-October, Elias woke to a knock at the door just before sunrise. 3 slow taps. Not the hurried knock of lawmen or the angry pounding of men with guns. This knock had patience behind it, worn knuckles, dusty resolve. He opened the door with a rifle in his left hand and coffee in his right. The man on the porch was tall, rail-thin, and dressed in tan cloth from neck to heel. A satchel hung from his shoulder, and his hair was bound in 2 long braids streaked with ash gray. "I'm looking for the man who gave my brother water," he said. Elias studied him. "You're not the first to come looking. I might be the last." He held out a folded piece of hide. Elias took it, unfolded it carefully, and read the inked message. It was simple, 6 words. "The fire you fed saved us." The man said his name was Nahuel, Tokala's older brother. He had ridden 4 days to get there, alone, no escort, no expectation. "I don't want to burden you," Nahuel said. "You're not. I just wanted to see the place." Elias gestured toward the bench beside the fire pit. "Then sit. You'll see more than you came for." Nahuel stayed 3 nights. On the 2nd night, he told stories around the fire. His brother's childhood, the long winters their people had endured, the way the elders had gathered after the men with guns left, speaking not of vengeance, but of thanks. "They saw you," Nahuel said, "even if you never saw them." "I felt them," Nahuel nodded. "That's enough." When he left, he tied a strip of red cloth to the gatepost. No symbol, no name, just a quiet thread of remembrance that rippled every time the wind touched it. Visitors returned that winter, more than usual. Some stayed in silence, some came with purpose. A woman named Ruth left her late husband's war medals beneath the oak tree. A young man played an old flute every morning until the frost melted. One night, a group of 6 arrived together, veterans from different wars. They didn't speak about what brought them. They spent 5 days building a stone wall behind the barn, 1 rock at a time. Not for defense, just presence. Before they left, one of them pressed a military patch into Elias's palm. "We were trained to fight," the man said, "but no one trained us how to stop." Elias didn't answer, just closed his fingers around the patch. When spring returned, the grass came back stronger, flowers bloomed without being planted. The trees along the north fence, dry and brittle for years, grew green again. Leah noticed first. She'd taken to visiting every weekend, bringing jars of preserves and fresh bread, always staying just long enough to check the fire and ask Elias if he'd been writing in the ledger. "I've added what I remember," he said. "What about what you've forgotten?" "I leave space for that." Leah smiled. "That's why you're the keeper." He shrugged. "I'm just the one with the porch." But he knew it was more than that. He knew the porch, the fire, the silence. It was all holding something heavier than memory. It was holding choice. Because the world hadn't changed. But here, people could. By the time summer reached its peak, the sky had turned pale with heat, and the grass in the pastures lay flat and quiet beneath the sun. Elias moved slower these days. His right knee stiffened when he sat too long, and the bones in his hands cracked each time he gripped the shovel. Still, he rose each morning before the light, stepped into the same boots he'd worn for 20 years, and walked the perimeter of the land like he was tracing the edge of something sacred. The fire behind the barn had not gone out once since Tokala left. Not when it rained, not when the wind screamed through the valley, not even when Elias fell sick that March and couldn't leave his bed for 3 days. Someone had kept it. A traveler passing through, maybe, or something else. He didn't question it. Some things weren't meant to be understood, only honored. In July, a child arrived. She couldn't have been older than 10. Alone. No shoes. A small cloth bag tied to her back with twine, and eyes that looked like they had already seen too much. She didn't cry, didn't ask for anything, just walked up the dirt path in the blue haze of early evening and sat down beside the fire. Elias watched her from the porch for a long time before approaching. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded once. He brought her bread and boiled eggs and a tin cup of well water. She ate without a word. He told me I'd be safe here. Elias folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "You're," he said. She stayed for 8 days. Said maybe 4 sentences total. On the last day she drew something in the dust near the fire with a stick, a hand reaching down toward a wounded bird. Beneath it she etched one word, "Begin." Then she left, walking the same road she had come from, slower this time, but with something lighter in her step. Elias never asked who he was. He didn't need to. The land remembered. By late summer, they began to come in pairs again, mothers and sons, sisters, 2 men who had fought for years before, sitting in silence beside the fire and touching hands for the first time since their father died. No one asked what the place was. They felt it. It wasn't a ranch anymore. It wasn't even a refuge. It was a wound that had become a scar, and scars, when tended with care, could guide others home. The first monument went up in September. Not stone, not metal, just driftwood gathered from the dry creek bed and lashed together with old rope. A child had built it, one of the quiet ones. He didn't call it anything, but others began leaving things around it. Bits of cloth, beads, a cracked compass, a bullet with the casing crushed. It wasn't meant to be sacred, but it was. The second monument was accidental. Elias had taken to walking the ridge each morning, and one day he found a small cairn near the edge, 4 stones stacked perfectly, balanced against the wind. He left it alone. The next day there were 2. By the end of the month the ridge was lined with them, markers of where people had stood, breathed, remembered. By autumn, Leah started keeping her own ledger. Elias didn't ask to read it, but one night she sat beside him at the fire and read from a page. A man came who didn't speak. He held his coat like a wound, stayed for 6 nights. On the last night, he asked if the fire would still be burning when he was ready to come back. I told him yes. He cried for a long time and left his boots. They never saw him again. But the boots stayed. Every winter, someone polished them. In October, a woman arrived with a guitar. She sang only once, the first night. A song in a language no one recognized, but afterward the fire burned taller, and several of the cattle that had wandered for days returned home. No one said thank you. No one needed to. The land had been thanked in full. Then came the day Elias woke and didn't know what year it was. He sat up confused, heart pounding, hands shaking. He got dressed anyway, made coffee, fed the chickens, but when he stepped out onto the porch, something inside him whispered, "It's time." He didn't run, didn't panic, and he just picked up the ledger, the hawk carving, the feather, and walked to the oak tree. He sat there for hours. Leah found him there, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm just remembering everything. Want help?" He looked up at her, smiled. "No, I want you to keep remembering it after I'm gone." She sat beside him, the 2 of them staring at the field where memory had taken root like wildflowers. "I will," she said. "I promise." He handed her the ledger, the feather, the hawk. "These are yours now." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. She had been preparing for this since the day she first saw him offer water to a stranger with no name. Elias stayed another week. Then one night, the fire behind the barn burned blue again. When Leah woke, he was gone, but there was a cup of water on the porch, still full, still cool. She drank it, sat in his chair, and began writing. The seasons turned with quiet ceremony. Fall softened into winter, and winter into a slow, muted spring that came more like a memory than an arrival. The snow melted early that year, giving way to a burst of wildflowers along the fence lines, colors Elias hadn't seen since his wife passed. Pale yellow, deep purple, streaks of red near the south pasture where the fire always burned. Leah didn't change much. She still sat in Elias's chair when the wind picked up. still ran her fingers along the wooden railing where the word "kept" was carved. She cleaned the inside of the house once a week, but left his boots where they'd always stood. The dog still lay beside the porch each night. One had gone deaf, the other blind. Neither wandered. They had no reason to. One morning, a man arrived with a suitcase and a limp. He looked like someone who had once been handsome before the world had taken too many swings at him. He didn't speak for 3 days, just watched the fire, slept in the cabin closest to the trees, and walked barefoot along the creek bed each morning as if he were tracing the edge of a life he barely remembered. On the 4th night, he finally asked, "Is this the place?" Leah didn't ask what he meant. She just said, "It is now." He stayed through the planting season, helped mend fence, feed the chickens, build 2 more cabins. He never told her his story. But on the day he left, he folded a worn photograph into her hand. A child, smiling. Himself, younger, standing in a military uniform, a date written on the back, years gone. Leah placed it in the ledger. That summer, they were visited by a girl no older than 17, with hair chopped blunt and eyes that looked like they'd stared down something terrible and said nothing back. She didn't come alone. She brought a boy, 5, maybe 6. He clung to her side and didn't let go for the first full day. They didn't ask for food or water, just rest. Leah let them sleep in the loft. That night the girl whispered to the fire, "I thought we'd have to run forever." Leah whispered back, "You don't." By morning the boy was laughing in the garden. She stayed for 2 weeks, left a bracelet made of shoelaces wrapped in copper wire. That same day, the woman with the guitar returned. She didn't sing this time. Just walked the edge of the pasture with a handful of white stones and placed each one in a line, leading away from the fire, like a path she'd been waiting years to finish. She didn't say goodbye, but Leah felt it when she was gone. The next autumn, an old pickup truck rolled down the dirt path dragging something heavy behind it. A trailer. Metal. Covered in canvas. From the dust and dents, it had been across more states than most people ever would. The driver was an old man with dark skin, white stubble, and a scar along his neck that he never mentioned. He parked beside the barn, stepped out, and looked at Leah like he had finally found the last page of a story he'd been reading too long. "I brought something," he said. She helped him lower the canvas. Beneath it a wooden cross, hand-carved, beautiful, simple. No name, no date, just a phrase burned into the wood. "He stopped a war. We remember." She asked who it was for. He said, "All of them." Together, they planted it on the hill above the fire pit. It stood tall, alone, not a grave marker, a testimony. By the first frost, someone had tied a string of feathers around it. The next day, someone else had wrapped a bandana around the base, and then a tin star, a bead, a letter in a glass jar, sealed with wax. The land remembered. It always had. One morning in early winter, a bus full of veterans came. Not an organized trip, just a cluster of men and women who had followed the same rumor and found each other on the way. They parked by the creek, built their own fire ring, and didn't speak until the 3rd day. Then, one by one, they stood and said the names of the people they couldn't save. Leah lit a candle for each one. When they left their boots lined along the porch rail. 20 pairs, worn and cracked, some missing laces. She didn't move them. When the snow came, it fell soft over the boots, like a blessing. Later that winter, a young woman came running through the trees in the middle of the night, breath ragged, face wet with rain and panic. Leah opened the door before she knocked. No questions, just water, a blanket, a seat beside the fire. The woman sobbed for an hour without words. Then, finally, she whispered, "They told me he was dead, the man who gave the warrior water, but I had to come to see if the place was still real." Leah took her hand. "It's real. You're here. That's proof enough." The woman stayed the whole winter, learned how to bake bread, milk goats, split logs. Listen, in the spring she built a bench beside the original fire ring, carved 3 words into it, "I am kept." And so the land grew, not in acres, in echoes. The story of the rancher who stopped a war by offering water became more than legend. It became code. People passed the story like a message. There's a place. When you're ready, go. Some walked, some hitchhiked, some didn't know why they were coming until they were already there. But the fire always waited. And Leah, older now, strong, quiet, weathered, kept the chair by the porch full and the water clean. And every night, when the stars blinked awake and the wind settled low, she added one more line to the ledger. Sometimes it was a name, sometimes a drawing, sometimes just a word. Healed, held, safe, kept. And when she closed the book each night, she'd sit back and whisper a single word to the dark. Peace. The fire behind the barn had always been more than heat. Even after all these years, Leah had never dared let it die, not once, not even on the nights when the wind howled so loud it bent trees sideways and blew grit through every crack in the walls. When the world around them changed, when governments shifted, when new towns rose and old ones vanished, the fire stayed lit. Because it wasn't just a memory, it was a boundary. One morning in early spring, a man in his 20s showed up barefoot, carrying nothing but a tattered notebook and a stitched-up jacket too small for his frame. He looked hollow, sunken-eyed. One side of his face was bruised purple-yellow, like it hadn't decided whether to heal or rot. He didn't speak when Leah met him at the gate, just looked at her with the eyes of someone who hadn't heard their name spoken with kindness in a long, long time. She nodded. "Come on," she said. "You look like you're tired of being followed." He slept for 5 days. When he finally emerged from the small cabin near the creek, he asked where the water was drawn from. She pointed. He went to the well, refilled the basin, didn't say another word for a week. On the 7th day he came to the fire, sat cross-legged and opened the notebook. He read aloud. Poems. About brothers who vanished, about mothers who waited, about noise that came from inside the head and couldn't be silenced with prayer or whiskey or war. When he was done, he handed the notebook to Leah. "I don't want to carry it anymore," he said. She placed it in the box beneath the ledger table and wrote in the ledger. He stopped speaking, and the silence said everything. Later that year, the storms came hard, the kind of storms that make cattle restless and dogs forget their names. One thunderclap cracked so close it split the tree near the back gate, the one with the metal wind chime hanging from it. The chime hit the ground and buried itself halfway in the dirt. Leah left it there. A week later, a man in a red poncho appeared, carrying a rolled canvas under one arm and a box of pencils under the other. He had a voice like gravel and hands stained with charcoal. "I was told this is where the ghosts stop screaming," he said. Leah nodded. "Sometimes." He stayed 6 days and painted the barn 3 times, not with color, with stories. He etched a hawk into one wall, a child curled at the feet of an oak into another, a circle of ash hands interlinked across the lowest beam. He didn't explain them, didn't need to. Before he left, he placed one last mark above the firewood rack. It was a bowl, a simple one, empty but not forgotten. In the early days of the next winter, the creek froze over, and for the first time in 15 years, the water supply slowed to a trickle. Leah, older now, bones stiffer, climbed the ridge to check the higher springs. She found a blockage, a tree limb wedged in a runoff passage, and spent the better part of a day digging it loose with frozen hands. She came back soaked and shivering, but she came back with water. That night the fire burned so bright that 2 people traveling from 3 towns over saw it from the main road and walked until their feet bled to reach it. When they arrived, Leah gave them bread, blankets, water. They didn't stay long, but before they left something neither she nor the land would ever forget. A child, wrapped in cloth, 3 months old, eyes closed, chest rising, left on the porch beside a letter. "You saved me once. I can't give her much, but I can give her this place." Leah wept, not loudly, just enough. She named the baby Ember, raised her in the same room where Elias had once stored tools. And Ember, bright-eyed and wild, grew up knowing stories the rest of the world forgot. She helped keep the fire lit. At 5, she placed her first stone at the foot of the oak. At 6, she drew a picture of a man giving water to a stranger. When Leah asked her why, she said, "Because that's when everything got better." Ember grew up with firelight in her eyes and smoke in her hair. By the time she turned 7, she could name every path through the pasture, every notch on the porch railing, every creak in the floorboards that told her who was home and who was only passing through. She knew when the silence meant peace and when it meant grief, and she never confused the two. She had Leah's steadiness and something wilder behind her eyes, something that belonged to the valley itself. The guests who came to the farm in those years learned quickly that Ember was not to be underestimated. She could carry a water bucket heavier than her arms should allow. She could split kindling with one swing. And she listened, really listened, like Elias used to, like every word was a thread in some larger fabric she had been born to mend. One afternoon, a man arrived with a limp and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He sat by the fire, said nothing for a day and a night, then asked if he could build a bench. Leah nodded. "We always have room." He worked through the morning, then into dusk, used cedar planks from the back shed and nails from a rusted tin under the steps. Ember brought him water every hour. He never thanked her aloud, but on the last trip he handed her a scrap of paper with a poem scrawled across it. She read it aloud to Leah that night. "I wandered until I found silence that held me. I left pieces of noise behind. I don't want them back." He was gone the next morning, but the bench remained. Ember carved a symbol into the back of it, a pair of cupped hands. "It's the place he was held," she told Leah. That winter was long. Snow came early and heavy. 2 fences collapsed under the weight. The goats got mean. The firewood stack ran low. Leah got sick. Nothing serious, just a chest cold that wouldn't let go, but Ember handled it, all of it, without complaint, without fear. She made the fire higher each night, read the ledger to herself in bed, whispered the stories into the rafters. And when Leah finally got better, she said, "You did more than keep this place." Ember just smiled. I listened. That spring a storm hit the ridge hard and fast. Lightning struck the southern tree line, setting a blaze that would have swallowed the pasture if not for the efforts of a dozen strangers who had arrived just days earlier. They carried buckets, dug trenches, formed a line from the creek to the fire. When it was over, one of them, an old woman with shaking hands and a voice like sand, said, "He gave water once, and now it returns." No one questioned what she meant. That same year, a young girl arrived from the city. No one knew who sent her. She didn't have any family listed on the intake card Leah kept in her drawer. All she had was a worn backpack and a necklace made from buttons. She didn't speak for 2 weeks. Ember tried everything, stories, drawings, offering her the best blanket in the loft, but the girl stayed silent. Then, one night, Ember walked her to the fire and said, "This is the place we talk without talking." The girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a photograph. Ember didn't look at it, just nodded. They sat in silence until dawn. The girl stayed the whole summer, and before she left, she added her own word to the ledger: found. By the time Ember turned 10, the ledger had grown too thick for a single binding. Leah and a carpenter, who once slept in the hayloft during a winter storm, built a wooden case for it, stained dark with oil and etched with the shape of the hawk that Elias once carried in his pocket. The fire behind the barn still burned. Ember fed it without being told. She did it the same way Elias did, just one log, no fanfare, no ritual. It didn't need ceremony. It needed consistency. One day in midsummer, a letter arrived. No return address, no stamp. Just a folded page slipped under the door. It read, "You gave me rest without knowing me." I sat beneath the oak and remembered how to pray. I told no one. But I tell you now, you stopped what would have started again, because peace doesn't come once. It has to be chosen every day. Leah placed it inside the box. That fall, Ember carved her first marker stone. She didn't say who it was for. She just walked into the pasture at dusk and placed it near the others. On its surface, a wave, a crow, and a single tear. She placed her hand on the stone for a long time. Then she said, "It's his now." She never said who he was. No one asked, because the land already knew. The winter that Ember turned 11 came early and stayed late. Frost clung to the grass long after the sun rose, and the air inside the cabins hung heavy with breath. Smoke curled low from chimneys, and the fire behind the barn burned higher than ever. Fed now by hands other than Ember's, new ones, calloused ones, trembling ones. Strangers who had come looking for something they couldn't name and stayed because the silence here knew how to hold them. Leah had grown slower. Her bones cracked when she stood too fast. Her eyesight faded just a little more each season, but she said it didn't bother her. "I see enough," she told Ember. "Everything that matters is still visible." That year, a man came who didn't say his name. He wore a coat with a patch torn off the sleeve and boots so worn you could see the bones of his ankles through them. He slept beside the fire in the dirt for 3 nights, not asking for anything. Ember offered him stew once. He shook his head. The next day she brought him a spoon and left it beside him without a word. He ate. Then on the 4th night he stood in the light of the flames and spoke. "I used to follow orders," he said. "Now I follow wind." Then he turned to Leah and handed her something small. A tooth. Not human. An animal's. It was set in silver. "For the one who kept me from becoming like the men I used to follow." He left before sunrise. The necklace stayed. It hung from the post at the edge of the fire pit from that day forward. Visitors began to touch it as they passed. They didn't know why. They just did. By spring, Ember had started her own ledger. She didn't call it that. She called it Stories from Firelight. Every page had drawings, not of people's faces, but of their hands, some open, some shaking, some clutching flowers or rope or keys or stone, some resting on other hands. She explained one day to a boy who asked, "Hands are what we offer." That same spring, a small caravan of riders came through, horses, wagons, the creak of old wheels and soft prayer songs hummed low. They weren't a tribe, not a church group, just people who had once been told they had nowhere else to go. They stayed for a week, helped build a new shelter near the oak tree. Before they left, the oldest among them, a man with one eye and no fingers on his right hand, left behind a staff carved with 22 notches. "Each one," he said, "a time I nearly broke. This place is the only one that made the next notch unnecessary." Ember asked to keep it. He smiled and bowed. She planted it in the ground beside the ridge and placed a stone at its base. On the stone she wrote, "The line we didn't cross." Leah began to walk slower. She still remembered everything, but her voice thinned out, less booming, less sharp. She let Ember speak more, trusted her with the welcome words at the gate, the fire, the records, the songs. One day, Ember asked, "What happens when you're not here anymore?" Leah didn't answer for a long time. Then she said, "Then the fire will still be. But who'll remember why it was lit?" "You will." And that was enough. One night in late summer, a storm came so fast no one had time to run. The wind knocked the porch chairs over, the fire jumped high, and one of the new cabins lost its roof. But no one screamed, no one panicked. They gathered under the trees, held on to one another, and watched the sky roar. When it passed, Ember stood in the center of the mud-soaked field, arms wide, eyes closed. She whispered, "He would have stood just like this." Leah watched her from the porch and nodded. Exactly like that. That fall, the first government car in more than a decade rolled down the path. Black, clean, tires that barely stirred dust. One man stepped out, wore a crisp jacket and sunglasses that didn't suit the light here. He asked for Leah. Ember stood between them. "She's resting," she said. He offered a letter, said it had to do with federal land easements, with mineral rights, with history and old claims. Ember didn't open it, just looked at him and said, "This land isn't yours." He smirked. "Everything belongs to someone." She pointed to the fire. "Tell that to the ones who left everything behind to be here." He left without forcing it. That night, Ember burned the letter, used it to light a cedar log. The fire snapped loud, like applause. Leah smiled in her chair. "You did good." "No," Ember said. "I did right." 2 days later, Leah passed. She went quiet in her sleep, hands folded across her stomach, her ledger beneath her pillow. She hadn't written in it that night. The last entry was the day before. It read, "She doesn't need me now. I am proud to rest." They buried her beneath the oak, beside Elias, beside Rosita. The oldest living guest sang a song no one had ever heard before and no one forgot after. And Ember lit the fire again that night, alone, but not lonely, because the ground beneath her had been soaked in footsteps, and the wind still carried the name of the man who had once given a dying warrior water without asking who he was. The first frost of the new year came quietly, just after dusk. Ember sat alone by the fire, wrapped in the blanket Leah had always used on cold nights. It still smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, and something else, age maybe, or memory. The sky stretched wide above her, starless at first, then slowly blinking to life one point at a time, like the universe was remembering itself. She had just finished splitting the last log when she heard the footsteps. Light, measured, unafraid. She didn't turn. "Are you here to stay?" she asked. A voice behind her, young, tired. "I don't know yet." "You don't have to know yet." The fire popped once. The figure sat beside her, a girl, 13 maybe, hands full of scratches, eyes full of someone else's storm. They watched the fire in silence. Later, the girl asked, "Is it true he stopped a war?" "Yes." "With just a drink of water?" "Yes." The girl didn't speak again for a long time. Then she whispered, "I've been angry for so long, I don't know what to do when I'm not." Ember nodded. "That's how most people find this place." She offered her a mug. The girl took it, drank, closed her eyes. And something shifted. Behind them, the porch light flickered. The wind changed direction. The trees whispered to each other. The fire burned steady. By spring, the girl had started planting marigolds beside the trail. No one told her to. No one asked her why. She just did, carefully, one cluster every 10 feet, like breadcrumbs leading people back to themselves. Ember added a new line to the ledger every evening. Names, moments, symbols. One entry simply read, "A woman arrived. She didn't say what she lost, only that it used to hum when she held it. She left her necklace tied to the cedar and slept for the first time in 6 years. The land kept all of it. And when the oak began dropping more leaves than usual that fall, Ember didn't panic. She just sat beside it and sang one verse over and over until her voice cracked. Not a song Leah taught her, a song that came from the soil. It said, "Peace does not come once. It comes daily as a choice." One day in late October, a man showed up on horseback, weathered, quiet, gray at the temples. He rode with a limp and carried a rifle he never touched. He stopped at the gate and looked at Ember for a long moment before dismounting. "I was there when the boy was found," he said. "Tokala?" she asked. He nodded. "I was the second rider. I held his blood in my hands, thought he would die. And now?" "He sends stories," the man said, "carved into wood, drawn into sand. You keep them better than anyone else." He handed her a box. Inside, dozens of small carvings, some painted, some burned, each one a moment. A fire, a pair of hands, a horse at full gallop, a cracked badge, an open palm. Ember placed each carving around the fire in a perfect circle. And when the wind rose that night, the flames didn't lean. They lifted straight up. That winter a letter came, written on thick, hand-pressed paper, from the new tribal council. It simply read, "What began on your land became a blueprint for something larger. We no longer meet in buildings. We meet under open sky. We begin every gathering with water. We end with silence. You are remembered. He is remembered." The letter smelled like sage. Ember didn't store it. She read it aloud by the fire and burned it, not to destroy it, but to feed the story it came from. The next day a boy came running, panting, crying. No shoes. Ember met him halfway. She knelt, held out a mug. "Are you here to stop something?" she asked. He nodded. "Then come in," she said. "We've got a fire that never dies." He drank, and she wrote one word in the ledger: "Begin."